I was always drawn to the strange and unexplained, so when I decided to create a podcast about unsolved mysteries, it felt like a natural extension of my freelance journalism work. My tiny apartment was soon transformed into a makeshift recording studio, cluttered with old newspapers, stacks of books, and a high-end microphone perched on my desk. I named the podcast The Forgotten Tapes and began scouring archives and contacting sources. It was during a visit to an old, dusty library in a neighboring town that I first stumbled upon the tapes. Hidden away in a back room, behind a locked cabinet, were a series of old cassette tapes. They were labeled with dates spanning the 1980s and 1990s, along with names I didn't recognize. My curiosity piqued. I borrowed an ancient cassette player from the library and began listening to the tapes in my apartment. The first tape was dated June 3, 1982, and featured an interview with a man named Richard Myers. The interview began innocuously enough, with Richard describing strange lights he had seen in the sky over his farm. But as the tape progressed, his voice grew more anxious, describing how the lights seemed to be watching him, moving closer every night. The tape ended abruptly, with Richard's voice cutting off mid-sentence. I felt a chill run down my spine. As I researched Richard Myers, I discovered that he had disappeared just days after the interview was recorded. His disappearance was never solved, and his farm had long since fallen into disrepair. Intrigued and a little spooked, I continued listening to the tapes. The second tape, dated July 14, 1985, featured a woman named Margaret Lane. She spoke of a shadowy figure she would see standing at the edge of her property every night. Her voice trembled as she described how the figure would move closer, step by step, until it was almost at her doorstep. Margaret's tape also ended abruptly, and like Richard, she had vanished without a trace shortly after the recording. The third tape, recorded on September 9, 1991, was perhaps the most disturbing. It featured a young man named Tommy Gray, who recounted how he had begun hearing whispers in his home, whispers that seemed to be calling his name. The whispers grew louder and more insistent each night, until he could no longer sleep. Tommy's tape ended with the sound of him screaming, and he too had disappeared shortly thereafter. The more tapes I listened to, the more unnerved I became. Each tape told a similar story, someone experiencing something strange and terrifying, followed by their sudden and unexplained disappearance. Despite my growing unease, I felt compelled to continue. I began to notice small, unsettling details in my own life. At first, it was just the feeling of being watched, an inexplicable chill in the room, or objects not being where I had left them. One night, as I was editing the latest podcast episode, I heard a faint whisper. I paused the audio playback, thinking it was just a glitch, but the whisper persisted. It was soft and indistinct, but I could swear it was saying my name. A shiver ran down my spine as I turned off the equipment and searched my apartment, finding nothing out of the ordinary. The next day, I visited the library again, hoping to find more information about the people on the tapes. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, seemed hesitant to talk about them. Those tapes have a dark history, she warned me. Many people who have listened to them have reported strange occurrences. Some say they're cursed. Undeterred, I continued my research. I tracked down old newspaper articles and police reports, piecing together the stories of Richard, Margaret, Tommy, and others who had vanished. The more I uncovered, the more it seemed like their disappearances were connected, not just by the tapes, but by something more sinister. One night, as I was reviewing my notes, I noticed a pattern. Each person had mentioned seeing or hearing something unusual, and each had disappeared shortly after recording their interview. I wondered if the act of recording their stories had somehow triggered their fates. As I pondered this, my apartment was plunged into darkness. The power had gone out. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to navigate the pitch-black room. As I reached the breaker box, I heard a loud thud coming from my living room. My heart pounded as I approached the source of the noise, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, like footsteps. When I entered the living room, I saw my coffee table overturned, the items on it scattered across the floor. There was no one there. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I decided to visit the locations where the people on the tapes had lived. I started with Richard Myers' farm. The place was abandoned, overgrown with weeds and vines. As I explored the dilapidated house, I found an old diary hidden in a drawer. Richard had written about his experiences with the lights, describing them in greater detail than he had on the tape. His last entry was particularly chilling. "They're here. I can see them outside the window." Next, I visited Margaret Lane's home, a small cottage on the outskirts of town. The house had been sold several times since her disappearance, but no one had lived there for long. Inside, I found a photo album with pictures of Margaret and her family. Tucked between the pages was a letter she had written to a friend, describing the shadowy figure and her growing fear. Her last words echoed in my mind, "I know it's coming for me." Finally, I went to Tommy Gray's apartment. It had been converted into student housing, and the current occupants were unaware of its dark history. I managed to find Tommy's old room, now occupied by a college student. I explained my podcast and asked if I could look around. The student agreed, albeit reluctantly. In the closet, I found a hidden compartment containing a notebook. Tommy had scribbled frantic notes about the whispers, drawing disturbing images of shadowy figures. His last entry was a scrawl of the word help over and over again. As I left Tommy's apartment, the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I heard the faintest sound of breathing right behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. My heart raced as I hurried back to my car, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. Back in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I was recording the latest podcast episode, the power went out again. My heart skipped a beat, and I heard the sound of glass shattering in the kitchen. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way to the source of the noise. One of the windows was broken, shards of glass scattered across the floor. A cold breeze blew through the opening, sending a chill down my spine. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened, I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. My flashlight beam caught it for just a second before it vanished, but that second was enough to sear the image into my mind, a shadowy form with hollow eyes, watching me. Desperate to escape the growing terror, I decided to leave town for a few days, hoping the distance would give me some clarity. I booked a room at a motel a few hours away and drove through the night. But even there, the eerie occurrences followed me. The TV turned on by itself, static filling the screen. The bathroom mirror cracked without warning, and I found strange symbols drawn in the steam on the glass. Realizing there was no escaping whatever was happening, I returned to the library to confront Mrs. Henderson. She was visibly shaken when she saw me, and it took some coaxing to get her to talk. She revealed that the tapes were part of a collection donated by a man named Arthur Caldwell, a local historian who had mysteriously disappeared shortly after compiling them. Arthur had been obsessed with the idea of recording the supernatural, believing that certain voices and events could be captured on tape and replayed, like an echo trapped in time. Mrs. Henderson warned me that Arthur's obsession might have led him to uncover something best left forgotten. Ignoring her advice, I decided to dig deeper into Arthur Caldwell's life. I discovered that he had lived in an old house on the outskirts of town, not far from Richard Meyer's farm. I made my way there, determined to find answers. The house was in ruins, the front door hanging off its hinges. Inside, I found stacks of old books, tapes, and recording equipment. It was clear that Arthur had spent his final days immersed in his work. As I searched the house, I found a hidden room in the basement, accessible through a trapdoor under a dusty rug. The room was filled with more tapes, labeled with names and dates, just like the ones I had found. In the center of the room was a desk, covered in papers. Among them was Arthur's journal, detailing his experiments with recording supernatural phenomena. His last entry was haunting. "I have captured their voices, but now they are capturing me. They are coming for me." As I read the entry, the room grew cold, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned around to see the same shadowy figure from my apartment, now more defiant and menacing. It lunged at me, and I barely managed to escape, scrambling up the stairs and out of the house. Back in my apartment, I knew what I had to do. The tapes had to be destroyed. I gathered them all and set them on fire, watching as the flames consumed them. As the last tape melted, the air grew still, and the eerie occurrences stopped. Exhausted and shaken, I collapsed onto the floor. I had uncovered the truth, but at what cost? The tapes were gone, but the memories of those who had disappeared remained. I knew I had to share their stories, to warn others of the dangers lurking in the shadows. The next morning, I uploaded the final episode of the Forgotten Tapes, detailing my harrowing experiences and the fate of the people on the tapes. As I hit publish, I felt a sense of closure, but the feeling of being watched never fully went away. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences subsided, but I knew they were never truly gone. The tapes had unleashed something dark and malevolent, and though I had destroyed them, the memory of their eerie presence lingered. One evening, as I was preparing for bed, I heard a faint sound, a creak, followed by the soft rustle of movement. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the curse was far from over. I had become the next chapter in the story of the Forgotten Tapes, forever haunted by the voices of those who had vanished. As I sat in my darkened apartment, the realization settled over me. The tapes might have been destroyed, but their stories lived on. And now, so did mine.